What's up guys, Jaxel here, just giving my first hands impressions on the new Dualshock 4 controller for the PlayStation 4. While the PS4 doesn't come out for another 2 weeks, the controller can already be found in the wild at stores and online. I want to put this video together to show how the controller works and how it addresses the many problems we had with the Dualshock 3. Now at first glance, the controller looks very similar to that of the DS3. However, upon closer inspection, there are many fundamental differences that end up making this one of the best general purpose controllers I have ever used. Keep in mind that the PS4 is not out yet, so all of my testing has been using this as a PC joystick. If we take a closer look, the first thing you'll notice is the touchpad in the middle. I haven't had any experience with this touchpad, but I can think of a great use case for it on the PS4. Imagine the game with a full screen map. You could theoretically use this touchpad to pinch and zoom and navigate the cursor location. That in itself may make the touchpad worth the price of entry alone, but beyond that I really can't comment on it. Another thing you might notice is the smaller touchstone areas for the D-pad and the face buttons. I originally thought these smaller areas would become an issue, but playing with the controller I never even noticed them once. However, because of the smaller touch tones on the face button area, the face buttons are now closer to each other than on previous Sony controllers. Now the buttons are pretty much the same distance apart as seen on the Xbox 360 controller. Again, I expected to have an issue with this, but once I started playing, I completely forgot that anything was changed. It was a non-issue. Probably the most significant change to the front of the controller besides the touchpad would be the analog sticks. On the DS3 controller, the analog sticks were convex. On the 360 controller, they were concave. On the DS4 controller, they are a mix between the two. The middle of each analog stick is convex, but the outer edges have a concave slant that help you keep your fingers on the nubs. This would be the most visual, but definitely not the most important. On the DS3, the analog sticks had a bad level of play. The resistance of the sticks would not be consistent throughout the entire circle of movement. While this was fine for slower paced games like RPGs, for fighting games this had decreased accuracy and was not ideal. The issue has been addressed and now the analog sticks move smoother and at a more consistent pace. Yet another change to the analog sticks would be the distance between them. While I have never had this issue, I have had people tell me they thought the analog sticks on the DS3 were too close together, and because of it, the controller felt cramped. Often, their thumbs would bump together. On the DS4, the analog sticks are actually further apart, making the controller feel a bit less cramped and far more comfortable like the Xbox 360 controller. This is one of those ever slight changes that probably only happened in order to fit the touchpad, but ends up making the world of difference. Looking at the back of the controller, the triggers on the DS4 are very different from the DS3. On the DS3, in order to make the triggers even semi-decent, you had to go out and buy $5 clip-on triggers that helped you keep your fingers on them without slipping. DS4 triggers now have an outward slant similar to that of the 360 controller. Now with all I've said, keep in mind the Sony controllers use a rubber membrane behind the buttons, and this membrane tends to break down over time and naturally get stiffer, unlike physical buttons which tend to get looser over time. I can't really give you a definitive comparison between how the buttons feel compared to previous controllers because the membranes on my PS1 and PS2 controllers have broken down, and my PS3 controllers are starting to get there. I can tell you that the buttons on the DS4 controller feel incredibly good, with the perfect amount of resistance while still feeling like a click, even though it's a rubber membrane. This is a stark contrast to how I feel about the Xbox 360 controller, where I think all the buttons, including the bumpers, have a very mechanical and unnatural feeling to them. The D-pad also feels pretty much the same as what we've grown to expect with Sony controllers, that being the best D-pad ever made. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So fighting game players who wish to use this controller will have no issue. Beyond all these changes, the DS4 also has a speaker on the controller similar to the Wiimote, a microphone port similar to a 360 controller, and a light bar. The light bar is supposed to be used for PlayStation Eye games, but I can imagine using a light bar and the speaker in conjunction with the controller to make it look like a controller is talking to you. One thing I would like to address when it comes to fighting games is the USB port. The DS3 controller used a mini USB port, which is problematic in fighting games. Many players like to play with the controllers plugged in. The problem was that fighting games were very frenetic, and if that USB cable moved even a little bit, it could become momentarily disconnected and trigger a resync to the console, thus pausing the game and forfeiting the round. The DS4, however, has opted to use a micro USB port, which is far more secure than mini USB. The micro USB cable has small metal hooks on them that ensure the cable will almost never get unplugged accidentally. It is curious though that Sony did not pack a micro USB cable into the package. Now let's talk about the PC use of this controller. Microsoft has packed their X input drivers directly into Windows 7 and Windows 8, so anyone could use their wired 360 controller on the PC. Sony has not had this advantage. Thankfully, with most games, I can simply plug the controller into your PC over USB and basic functions will work without a hitch. Unfortunately, some games are programmed to require an X input compatible controller, which means if you're using a non-Xbox 360 or Microsoft controller, it just won't work at all. However, third-party workarounds for this have been developed, such as Xbox 360 controller emulator, which lets your non-X input gamepad act as an X input controller. I've had this issue with a few games, mostly games from Ubisoft and Devolver Digital. Remember though, I did state that only basic functions will work on PC, and at the moment I could not find any games in which the rumble feature on the DS4 functioned properly. However, even with the lack of rumble features on the PC, this is probably one of the best controllers I have ever used. I can't imagine playing a PC game on something else anymore, and I've only been using it for a few days. And that's with the features currently missing on it. I can imagine this controller on the PS4 being full featured. In time, people may consider it the greatest controller ever made. Anyway, thanks for watching. You guys are going to like this controller. Even if you plan on getting an Xbox One, I do recommend picking up this controller, even if to only use it for a PC. Even if you have to use Xbox 360 controller emulator, this controller is fantastic. Anyway, have a good night.